Hi, David.
Hello, Bob.
How you doing?
Indifferently well.
That's not a bad way to be. Indifferent is better than about 50% of the alternatives. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are David Ottlinger. I don't know. Would we describe you as a freelance philosopher? Is that freelance writer?
I'm a little iffy about claiming the mantle of philosopher. My background's in philosophy, is what I always like to say. Mm-hmm. But I definitely come at things from a philosophical perspective. Mm-hmm. So I'm a freelance, whatever that is.
And you do know a lot, an inordinate amount about Immanuel Kant, do you not?
You could say that.
More than is healthy. At the very minimum, we can say that.
But there's so much deeper you can go. I mean, it's amazing. The way the Kant literature is just drinking from a fire hose.
You mean because they're writing so much about him now? Or do you mean his own writing?
Oh, yeah. No, what's being written on Kant is massive. And it's just... when I was working on something on Kant, a professor once told me, don't worry about thinking, has somebody said this before? Of course they have. Mm-hmm. Just work so that when you discover that other version, the person who had the thought before you, that it's as best a version, that your version can sit alongside it.
Right.
Because it's just, you can't. And it's even, people talk about it in the literature that, like, somebody said that a book that was supposed to be about Kant was about books that are about Kant. And, you can get lost in the literature and end up kind of missing the man himself.
Part of that sounds just like life on the internet. I mean, of course, whatever you're about to say has been said by somebody, somewhere. You have to let go of that problem.
But this is, somebody said it and it's been peer reviewed and edited and published in a scholarly journal. So,
well, that's a time saver.
Yeah.
From your point of view. See, you can just go ahead and publish. You can just go ahead and publish and skip all that because it's been vetted. Let me explain what we're going to talk about. My appetite for this conversation was whetted by a conversation that you had with Dan Kaufman several years ago about Kant on his show, Sophia. And by the way, people can now find that show on the electric Agora, new home for the show. It's a home he's been building a long time. It has long been a place you can find very good writing about philosophy. And maybe there was I don't know if there were videos and audio stuff, but now the show Sophia is going to be headquartered there. So people can just Google Electric Agora, Agora. I'm not even sure that's the correct pronunciation, but in any event, is that like a square in ancient Athens or something where philosophers hung out? What is an agora?
Yeah, the Agora is the center marketplace. It was very much the center of public life. And philosophers met there and spoke to people. And the Stoa, for which Stoics are named, was a particular porch, which they were just known as the people who hung out on the Stoa, which is all Stoic means. Yeah, it was a much more communal life in the ancient world. So I always point out that people thought, I think it's Julius Caesar, was strange because he read silently.
Really? So it was more common to read out loud, I take it. I think I can.
I mean, even through the Middle Ages, reading was mostly public. The kind of world where you can go off to bed and kind of go into your own intellectual world is very modern. We kind of take it for granted, but...
Of course, there were fewer people who were literate back then. So maybe that's one reason people were reading out loud. But so this Kant thing, I do want to drill down on this Kant thing, because for one thing, I definitely need somebody to explain him to me. He's not the most... I mean, you never know. You're reading him in translation when you read him. So the few times I've tried to read him, I haven't been reading him in his native tongue. Maybe that's part of the problem. But he's not known as the most accessible writer. No. You compare him to, say, David Hume, also writing in the 18th century, and I would say there's a difference in clarity.
The young David Hume was similarly unclear. The older David Hume was a great stylist.
Oh, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the treatise reads a lot like the critique, maybe better, it's still, but yeah, pretty much everyone.
Meaning, we should say for non-insiders, a treatise on human nature, you're saying reads as obscurely as a critique. A critique of human. Wait, what is the title of that Kant book? It's a critique of human reason. Is that it?
Critique of pure reason.
Critique of pure reason. Okay.
Which actually pure does not play a big role in the book. So it's kind of funny that it's in the title.
Yeah, I'll have to take your word for that. I definitely don't have a rejoinder. So there's a couple of things in particular. I mean, I'll tell you that the concept, my interest in Kant is partly grounded in a misunderstanding on my part. And this is kind of interesting. Now, there is this idea of the numinous or noumenal, right? There is the phenomenal world and the noumenal world. There are phenomena and there are noumena. This is a distinction that Kant is famous for. And I don't bother to correct me in real time. I'll give you the chance to correct me. But part of the idea, we can say at a minimum, at the risk of some understatement probably, that the noumenal world, noumenal things are, to put it mildly, less accessible to our perception than phenomenal. What we see is the phenomenal part of reality, and then there is said to be this noumenal part. Now, there's also, there's a couple of other, okay, so first of all, Schopenhauer later puts the concept to some kind of use that we don't have to get into, but we might. But the thing that I had been confused about is that, do you know at all the work of Rudolf Otto, this book, The Idea of the Holy?
No.
He makes a big deal of what he calls the numinous. And Kant uses the term the numinous, right? As well as...
I'm assuming this is a Christian?
Yes. But it turns out, and I had thought, because he says the numinous, and he says like the primordial religious experience is an encounter with the numinous. It's this wholly other thing, not ordinarily apprehendable. And so I had thought, well, that kind of has something to do with Kant's idea of the numinous. But it turns out that Rudolf Otto's numinous, and the further thing is that Kant, I think we'll talk about this, but had a religious side that was not totally unrelated to his conception of the numinous, maybe, but we'll get into that. So all these things, to my mind, pointed to Otto having picked up on Kant. No, it turns out that Rudolf Otto's numinous is spelled Numinous. They have nothing in common, at least they do not have a common etymological root. One is of Latin origin, one is of Greek. And
is it numinous?
It's Numinous, and the etymology, I think, is specifically grounded in the kind of divine, the spiritual, in a way that Kant's is not.
Is it from Nous?
Could be. I don't know, but I only recently found out it's a phonetic coincidence, which is just interesting because it could not be a coincidence, right? It could be like this is the encounter with ultimate reality, because you could describe Kant's numinous as ultimate. You could describe it as ultimate reality without too much of a stretch, right? And Kant was religious and so on. So it's just a weird thing that I only discovered like today that Otto's numinous is the wrong numinous.
Well, maybe not. I wouldn't be satisfied on just that ground that he wasn't invoking Kant. He may well have been. There's a tradition of understanding Kant in which that kind of understanding of noumenal would seem very Kantian, particularly. Sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. But yeah, that could, in the sort of two worlds interpretation of what Kant means by transcendental idealism, the noumenal is something apart from this reality that we experience in our own sort of empirical daily life, and it's also apart from what's conceived of in the sciences. So apart from nature in that sense. So it can be, it's on that interpretation, it is its own kind of different reality, sort of existing parallel to our own. So that may well be an invocation of Kant. The only thing in your little spiel you started with that was incorrect was that you said the numinous is less accessible.
Well, I said that's an understatement. It's wholly inaccessible according to Kant, right?
Exactly, right.
And
on any interpretation, it's wholly inaccessible.
That's not controversial then, as a reading of Kant. And that would be one distinction between Kant and Otto, because Otto is saying that it's possible to have this kind of breakthrough experience where the divine, he would say, but also this thing he's calling the numinous, although wholly other from our ordinary experience, is suddenly accessible to us.
Right.
And Kant would say it's never accessible to you.
It's never accessible to you. Maybe Kant could have had some kind of notion that it could be accessible to you, but it would have to be a non-rational experience. You would need some kind of way to experience that did not involve the concepts and experiences that we have all the time in empirical life. But as far as I know, Kant never really entertains that kind of possibility. He's much more, there was the time where Jesus was asked, what about people who get remarried at the end of, it was a pharisaical conversation. So when people go to heaven after they're dead and they were married to one person and then that person died in life and they remarried, then how did they all get along in heaven? And Jesus says something along the lines of, I care about what's here in this world now. And, Kant is that kind of Christian. He's concerned about ethical life and morality, and he doesn't spend a lot of time in sort of, he wouldn't approve of pining after the noumenal world.
He wouldn't.
No.
Is there a religious connection for him? I mean, even is one even conjectured to, a connection between kind of religion and this idea of this kind of unknowable aspect or realm of reality? Yeah. And what is it?
Very complicated.
Well, should we back up then and talk a little about noumena and phenomena, or what do you think is the best way to proceed?
Let me say a few words on religion and then back up to phenomena and noumena. He believed that there were three, and then he kind of added a fourth in a later book, but I'll just focus on these three in the Critique of Pure Reason. Three ideas, which are different from concepts, which is God, freedom, and the soul. And they're all unconditioned, which is they all in some way exist outside of the causal order, and particularly the idea of God is the highest good. He's good without any condition or any qualification, you might say. And it ends up playing a kind of important place in his ethics, where you can't know whether God exists, but he's very concerned to demonstrate that it's rational to hope God exists. So, and famously in the Critique of Pure Reason, he calls his project "Limiting Reason to Make Room for Faith." And it's a subtle idea. My teacher, Eric Wilson, liked to emphasize this. You might wonder why he cares so much about he's very concerned to argue that there could be a world in which the most moral thing, doing the most moral thing at all times, is also the happiest life. Mm-hmm. And you might think, well, that's an odd preoccupation. But to Kant, if that weren't coherent, then his whole notion of morality would not be coherent. And for someone who conceives of ethical life as a kind of rational action, mm-hmm. that incoherence would be a serious philosophical problem. So God is unknowable, but having faith in him is important in order to be good. It's part of kind of moral practice, if you like.
Okay.
Yeah.
So okay. So, and then there's freedom in the soul.
Oh God. Yeah.
Should we go through those before we get back to the question of the connection between the numinous and Kant's religion? Go, feel free.
Basically, I won't get into it too much, but those are both the unconditioned. We can't know whether they exist or not. Mm-hmm. And for Kant, we can't know whether we ever acted freely and autonomously or not. Because a free action and which is totally outside the causal order of nature can always look exactly like some causal, some causally determined action. Mm-hmm. And similarly, we can't know ever if we have a soul. We could just be minds sort of instantiated in bodies, like modern computationalist things, mm-hmm. or our minds could be something noumenal, or that gets tricky. Or there could be a noumenal aspect of ourselves, but we'll get
kind of
to
a
that.
hidden aspect,
right? Hidden
hidden from us.
Yes.
Okay. Which most modern psychologists would say there is, at least in the sense of unconscious information processing. But he would have had nothing a more profound. He was thinking metaphysically, not
right. Exactly.
Like
it's something that can endure outside the body.
Right.
So all three of those ideas, we can't know them. We can't know whether they exist, but they have great sort of practical importance in living an ethical life.
Okay. And so the numinous has a possible. So are they all aspects of are they all directly related to the numinous in the sense that they're not knowable, in the sense that we can't see them, or
yes,
or what? So they
they're outside the bounds of possible experience. That's a common Kantian formula. So they're outside of anything that we can ever have any kind of empirical relation to. Mm-hmm.
So it works well with his religious belief. I mean, it sounds like, so he's saying all three of these are, their existence is unknowable, God,
yes.
freedom, and the soul. So he's strictly speaking an agnostic.
Yes.
But very religiously inclined.
Yes, and pretty, I mean, I would call him a Christian.
A Christian agnostic.
Yeah, and even a Protestant, really. But he's non-Orthodox, but he's pretty Christian, and he was faithful. And his preoccupations are typical of his era, and he was, like a lot of sort of Protestant-inclined intellectuals, he was concerned about enthusiasm, the kind of emotion-based kind of like our modern evangelicals, where they put they think if you're not experiencing some deep emotion in service or in prayer or, in other religious practices, then you're not really getting down to a relationship with God. Mm-hmm. And to Kant and to a lot of people, that made religion an irrational and impulsive and untrustworthy kind of practice. I'm not passing any judgments myself here, but he was very concerned to oppose that kind of vision of religious life, if you like.
Mm-hmm. And I guess it stands to reason, if he thinks there can be no direct connection, in a way, to God, freedom, or the soul, in a certain sense, that he wouldn't imagine people being suddenly possessed by forces emanating from this realm.
Right, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, one way to view this is as the numinous is as working well with his religious beliefs, and then the other angle of approach is to locate it along the spectrum of ideas in that era about the way we apprehend reality, the way the mind apprehends reality. Now, you said something in your conversation with Dan Kaufman that I don't think I totally get, but I think must be related to this, which is that it was a question of the empiricists, I guess, had said that the mind conforms to the objects out there in reality. They kind of make an impression on it or something, but it adapts to them. It is a response to them. And you're saying Kant said that the objects actually conform to the mind, which I don't get. I mean, it makes the objects sound like they're playing an active role, right? Or something like, whereas I think of them as just kind of out there. I'm the active being. Right. Now, if this doesn't have anything to do with the numinous, you can tell me now, and maybe we don't have to go down this road, but I think it must.
It has everything to do with the numinous.
So what is that? How can we make sense of this idea that when we perceive things, it is the object, is the thing we're perceiving that is conforming to my mind? Right.
So this is what Kant calls the Copernican revolution in philosophy.
Right.
Where he says basically what we still think of, and actually sadly what a lot of philosophers think of as perception, is there's an object. Let me not use this because I'm recording.
Yeah, that object is recording your voice, so maybe you shouldn't move it around wildly. But
I'll use this one.
Okay, yeah, that seems
okay. So here's an object. I can see it. It is white, rectangular, solid, flexible. It moves in such and such a way. Because it's out in the world in a white, rectangular, flexible way, then it causally impacts me and my receptive capacities as both my eyes, but also more profoundly neurologically in some way, where it makes me represent this object as being white, rectangular, flexible, etc. Through my the different modalities of sense aren't going to really matter. So I'm touching it. I can tell it's flexible by moving it. I can tell it's white by seeing it, et cetera, et cetera. If I can.
That's the empiricist view and the conventional view, and one that makes immediate sense to me. And then there is Kant's view.
And then there is Kant's view, which is, well, it's one of two things, but either one involves us giving in structure to the empirical world in such a way that what we experience in the empirical world evinces an order that actually comes from our minds.
Okay. Well, that's getting to be more intelligible to me, and in a way more in keeping with, a certain amount of cognitive psychology even, and study of perception.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I said, here's this object. It has all these properties. One of the things I said it was is rectangular. Rectangularity is a spatial concept. Mm-hmm. And it's also here now. And if I look away and if I look back, it's still here now, which means I'm also orienting it in time.
Okay, wait. So, so it's here, it's oriented in space.
Uh-huh.
It's here now, and it's here later. That's what you mean by orienting in time.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, those are statements you can make. To make a statement like that is to orient it in time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And also, I represent it as an object. That's a lot of psychology and psychologically minded modern philosophy kind of makes me sad because they don't attend to Kant and Hegel's very important insights onto this. It's not true of all of them, but of many. Why did I think that this rectangularity, this whiteness, this greenness over here, this flexibility, this solidness, all these extremely complicated properties, all this kind of rich sense data that I'm getting in, why did I think that this was one thing? Why did I connect it? And why didn't I view it as, here's my hand on it, but it's not part of my body. There's the white wall behind it. It's distinct from that. How did I do that? And one of the key insights of Kant is that there's a kind of logical form to perceiving. So one way he would describe, and I'm now at a point where anything I say is somewhat controversial because there's so many different ways of understanding Kant. But one way that I think Kant would think about this is when we take all those properties and we connect them into an experience of a thing, that's called synthesizing a manifold of properties into an intuition. And so just...
The intuition being that this is a unified thing.
Yes. And particularly, the intuition is what's in my mind when I look at the book and say, this book. And I perceive the whiteness, the greenness, the rectangularity, everything as part of the book, right? So it's all unified. And so one insight here is that unlike the sort of naive empiricist view, where there's an object, it's in a causal relation to me, and it causes the representation in my mind. Representing this is an active process, which has a kind of, the linguistic idiom is going to be foreign to Kant, but has a kind of grammar, or as he would say, a kind of logic. And it's a very complicated operation that we often don't notice as complicated, because it's so basic to our kind of operation, and we do all of it so quickly. But each one of these little perceptions is so rich and complex.
So if the empiricists say, the objects are kind of out there and your mind is conforming to a given object, then Kant would say, well, the very idea that it is an object is something you're actually projecting onto it.
Yeah.
And
important to say naive empiricist.
Naive empiricists would say that. Okay.
Yeah.
But I characterize Kant's view accurately. I mean, it still seems to say that the objects, okay, so I see what you mean. The objects are conforming to your mind. In other words, there may or may not be unity to this thing that you see unity in. And that's what we mean by saying the object conforms to your mind. I mean, by even its being an object is in a way catering to your presuppositions.
Right. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I want to kind of break that down, because there are two aspects to how we inform the world. And one is what I've already alluded to, which he thinks is part of what at least sometimes he refers to as our passive kind of capacity, our perceptual capacity. And he thinks the forms of our passive capacity, which he identifies with intuition, the forms of our receptivity are space and time. And then there's this active part of experience, which sort of takes up and organizes and works with the material provided by the receptive part of the mind. And the form of the active part of the mind is the categories or the pure concepts of the understanding. And Kant thinks those have to come from us, which he's picking up on an argument for David Hume, partly because, maybe you can see white, you can see green, you can see rectangular, but how could you? It's like, this is a book. I can recognize it as a book because I've seen other books in the past, and I empirically generated the concept book, right? Based on past experiences. How could I do that with objecthood?
Say that again. How could you do what with objecthood?
How could I empirically generate the concept objecthood in the way I empirically generated the concept book?
And Kant says you can't.
You can't. They came in the box. Basic concepts like property and relation, cause and effect, agent and patient, object and property are part of the architecture of understanding.
Okay. Let me, I want to throw something out. Are you very familiar with the Buddhist concept of emptiness?
I'm pretty familiar with it.
It's not unrelated. Okay, so one way to put it is that things don't have essence. That if you really pay close attention to your perceptions, you are attributing essence to things. You are, you have this idea that, an example might be, like if you're walking in the parking lot, you're walking up to your car, and you're about to put the key, and you realize, oh, it's not your car, it's somebody else's car, you'd be like, whoa, I got to reorient here. And that would be because you had been attributing kind of essence of your car to that car, and then suddenly you're viewing this vehicle and no longer has essence of your car. It can actually be a powerful emotional experience. And I have, in my book, Why Buddhism is True, I argued that really, fundamentally, it's our affect that imparts essence to things. And that if you, but anyway, and that if you talk to people who say, Buddhists who say they've experienced emptiness, and I've talked to some, and they tell me what it's like to view the world once you're experiencing emptiness, I say, and I think there's good reason to, I don't think I'm the first person to say this, that affect is so centrally involved in the construction of essence, but I think what they've done is through meditation and other things, they've really toned down their affective reaction to the world generally. Now, what they say is, you say, well, what's it like? And they say, well, you can still tell the difference between your computer and a light bulb, but they just don't project their identities so strongly. Now this isn't, I don't think this is Kantianism. But it's also not totally unrelated, because they are saying that there's a part of our, almost the central thing that infuses things with a sense of form and discreteness, separation from the rest of the world, is projected by us. They don't have those things in them.
Right. So Kant's informing has nothing to do with affect. So that's a difference to know.
Well, by the way, a lot of Buddhist philosophy does not have anything. The Buddhist philosophical justification for emptiness doesn't have anything to do with affect. It has to do with in a way with the seamlessness of causality and with seamlessness generally. That would be. Well, could be a little wrong about that, but that's the nature of the philosophical justification. My claim, though, is that when people say, oh, I've seen the truth of emptiness, it isn't really an intellectual apprehension so much as a change in the role of affect in their perception. So it's a different thing. The Buddhist philosophy of emptiness doesn't invoke affect. I just want to be clear.
Right. So the insight that you're supposed to have in Buddhism is, when you go to put your key in somebody else's car and then you say, it's not my car, and then you realize none of the cars are my cars. They're all just cars.
Including yours? Including your car, you mean?
Right, yeah.
Oh, okay.
And then none of the cars are cars.
None of the cars are cars, innocent. There is no such thing as essence of car. Yeah, I was talking about essence of my car, but you're right. Then there is the idea of essence of car.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So there's actually an ambiguity within Buddhism, which could get into the ambiguity in Kant, because there are, one of the images of there's the Buddha's like the lotus that grows up from beneath the water and then grows up through the water and then blossoms on the other side of the water, on top of the water. And the water is supposed to be the world in the metaphor, and the Buddha comes through the world but transcends in some sense out of the world, right?
I'm not that conversant in this particular. I mean, there's a billion different Buddhist traditions and metaphors and stories, but so I can't vouch for any one interpretation of this one. But yeah,
I like that idea because it's nicely ambiguous. Which there's a metaphysically strong version of that, which is the more theological kind of view. Peter Harvey in his book said, if Jesus is God become man, for many Buddhists, Buddha just takes the reverse itinerary. So if you could view becoming enlightened as getting into this other realm, which is this metaphysical plane, which is the air above the water, right? In the metaphor. It's a sort of different plane.
Yeah, and in fact, by the way, you used the word unconditioned earlier. Yeah. It is the unconditioned in Buddhism. You have escaped the realm of causality.
Right. Right.
And there's a kind of logic, there's kind of way that can make sense, but go ahead.
Well, the metaphysically strong version is that it's a separate realm that becoming enlightened gets you to. Mm-hmm. So you get out of the world and into the non-world, the beyond world. And there's one time the Buddha said that the Dharma, which is Buddhism, is like a raft that gets you to the other shore, and then you leave it behind once you get to the other side. So that's, I think, an image where that really implies that what's outside the world is this other realm that you can get to and then move around in.
Yeah.
And then there's the metaphysically sort of deflated Buddhism, which is what you and Stephen Batchelor and people like that tend to profess, where it's not transcending reality, isn't getting into some metaphysical out there. It's just seeing the limitedness of seeing all of our kind of constructions of empirical reality as only constructions of empirical reality.
That can be part of it. But I also think, I don't, it depends on what you mean by metaphysical. I do think there's a meaningful sense in which moving toward enlightenment is moving toward the unconditioned. I needn't get into it now. I mean, people can Google my piece on nirvana that appeared in Aeon, which was an excerpt from my book. AEON is the magazine. But anyway, no, I take your. I mean, what I think I would say, and Stephen Batchelor would say. I don't think we're saying exactly the same thing, but I think we're both saying we would leave out what we consider supernatural, leave out what's religious in the sense of supernatural, and yeah, we're so yeah. That's true. It doesn't mean you're not in any meaningful sense transcending anything, but
no,
anyway.
and indeed, yeah. that's and Kant's philosophy is a transcendental philosophy. So it's called transcendental idealism. Is what this positing of phenomena, noumena. That's what he terms it transcendental idealism.
And is it easy to say what those two words mean in that context? Is the idealism the idea that, well, what is that the idea that there is this other realm or other aspect beyond the real? No.
Well, realm or aspect, right? Because
we'll get into that question.
Right.
We'll get into that question, but I mean,
no, well, we've gotten into that question already, because the Buddhism. What I was talking about with the Buddhism, the two different concepts of either you're just trying to realize that there's reality considered apart from everything we bring to it, or there's a sort of transcendent other reality which sort of exists separately and maybe has its own structure. And the question is, which of these did Kant mean? And there's a lot of ambiguity within the text and within different interpretations. In the same way, there's an ambiguity within Buddhism.
So this is conventionally put as, when he made the phenomena noumena distinction, was he talking about two worlds or two aspects, right? And is it sounds like the two worlds, just to listen to the word, would be more deserving of the term transcendental. Does that make sense? I mean, is that, well, maybe you should tell us why he called it transcendental idealism. Transcendental in what sense?
Right. Well, that's certainly the version of transcendental idealism that goes off and plays with a lot of different theologies. And
you mean the two worlds? The
two worlds version.
That's the one that was more picked up by theologians And
usually, yeah. Or that's my perception. I'm less knowledgeable about theology than.
Okay, makes sense.
And also, there's an interpretation of Hegel, which we're not going to talk about, which is kind of a different flavor of this kind of version of Kant, which has certainly been important to Christians and Christian philosophers and theologians. But what did you ask me just now?
I was asking about drilling down into the meaning of the word transcendental. Right, I'd settle for either drilling down into transcendental or idealism, actually. I mean, as the why he called his philosophy transcendental idealism, and whether that maps pretty directly onto this idea of noumenal phenomenal.
Yes, and in fact, you could only really explain them both at once, the transcendental and the idealism. So it's ideal insofar as it comes from our own minds. So the structure of the world that we see and experience has a structure that's mental, that's given to it by us, which has a certain kind of resonance with the idealism of Berkeley or, Berkeley. Of course, the kind of classic idealists were concerned to deny that there is really matter. They wanted to dissolve the distinction between mind and world by getting rid of world, really. It's just everything is all the empirical objects that we see are really thoughts in the mind of God. So
so we weren't just projecting some really fundamental things onto a world out there. We were kind of dreaming up the world.
Okay. Well, the point is,
very loosely speaking.
Everything is mind stuff. It's not mind stuff and matter stuff. It's only mind stuff.
Right.
And Kant isn't saying that, but he is saying that the world is given this ideational form, that's the ideal part, from us and from our operations, our mental operations, and that transcends all of our possible experiences. There's no way we can relate to an external world except through space-time and the categories. So all of our experiences are spatiotemporal categorical. They all have this form given to them by pure reason.
And I guess I'm just thinking out loud, but some Buddhists might say, well, actually, you can let go of the categorical.
Right.
Which is even if space and time stubbornly persist.
Right. And like I said, Kant's not a mystic kind of guy.
Yeah.
He wants to get on with it in this world. So he's not interested in those possibilities.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking Schopenhauer might be a case of applying some Kantian ideas to mysticism, but I'm really not so sure. Schopenhauer. Yeah. You think he is? Oh, I mean,
Schopenhauer was Wilhelm Dilthey, Arthur Schopenhauer, and Leopold von Ranke were part of a back to Kant movement in the late 19th century, which is, here's the thing. The first version of the first critique came out in 1781. Hegel had basically completed his system by, I think, 1821. So within that 40-year space, we get this massive system from Kant, and we get this massive system from Fichte and from Schelling, and then this massive system from Hegel. And for a long time, Hegel just dominated, and just so much happened so fast intellectually that they kind of, a lot of European philosophy moved on to Hegel in some ways before they'd really digested Kant. Mm-hmm. So then there was a kind of a movement back to Kant.
Was Schopenhauer kind of a rival of Hegel's? Were they at the same university or something?
They hated each other.
Because because all the kids went to Hegel's lectures, right? And Schopenhauer was left twiddling his thumbs. So I'd reject Hegel too if I were him. Totally.
It was standing room only in Hegel's classes, and he always scheduled his classes to be at the same time.
Oh man!
To make his students choose.
That's cold.
Yeah,
I hate people like that.
Well, it's the classic case of the vindictive one is the loser. Because
wait, who intentionally scheduled his classes to conflict with the
Schopenhauer was the really resentful one.
I don't know. Well, he was.
I don't know what Hegel's attitude. Yeah, I don't know what Hegel's attitude to Schopenhauer was, if he had one.
So naturally, Schopenhauer leads it back to Kant movement and away from Hegel movement.
Yes, right. So, but it was a larger movement. Kind of in that moment of the 19th century, where Hegel's domination started to slip a little bit. Although Hegel really remains the dominant figure for 19th century European philosophy. And
is he harder to understand than Kant?
Yeah.
Yeah, the old joke. The old joke. Have you read Hegel? Not personally.
Yeah, right. No, that's. I always joke that it took reading Hegel for me to appreciate what Kant does right in his writing. And I know someone who will be nameless who was well on the way to being a Hegel scholar, and spent 3 days reading Hegel and understood nothing and said, forget it, and became a Kant scholar. So,
yeah, I don't get why Hegel ever caught on from what limited understanding I have of him. But
I do. But
what was the key to it? Good branding? What was it?
No, there is some powerful philosophy there, but it's very, very difficult.
Okay. So anyway, let's see, where were we? I
said something about what transcendental means and what idealism means. So does that, particularly I'm thinking about the transcendent part, because it's not transcending as in getting out of, it's kind of the opposite, right? It transcends the spatiotemporal categorical form of pure reason, transcends all of our experiences. It informs everything, all experience we can have.
Okay, it is just presupposed by us in a way that leaves us incapable of understanding what reality would seem like if it weren't presupposed by us.
Yes, and sort of like, it's a lens through which we view.
Mm-hmm. I'll buy that. And I guess, and Kant was the first to. I mean, you hear particularly the idea of space and time as a priori categories. He gets credit for that, right? Yeah. The idea that they are special. We bring them to everything, and
Well, particularly the idea that they come from us.
Yeah.
Because for Newton, which is one of the people Kant is concerned to argue with, and for Leibniz in a different way, space is something that exists independently of us. For Newton, it's a big sort of empty, organized container, which all of matter sort of exists within. Mm-hmm. And for Leibniz, it's a kind of Leibniz's view is obscure, but it's a kind of system of relations between things that exist. But in either case, it's something that exists sort of between or transcending stuff out there. But for Kant, it comes from us. and is given to the world insofar as we experience the world that way. And so one thing to maybe make worth noting is Kant thinks space and time are kind of the human modes of experiencing the world.
He doesn't think my dog thinks in terms of space and time?
I don't know if he ever addressed animal cognition in that way, but he might say we don't know. That's kind of, and there's I think he runs into trouble there about the publicity of space and time. So how do I know that you organize your world in spatiotemporal ways and or you mean the same things by space and time that I mean by space and time? But that's a different topic, I guess. But he thinks that the categories exist for all finite knowers, which moves us, I think, forward towards understanding the phenomenal and noumenal distinction.
So finite knowers means everyone except for God, basically, or what?
Yeah. Okay. And God, the infinite knower, knows by creating. I've been toying with this formulation, and I'm not sure what I think of it yet, but it's sort of like the object itself. Well, okay, so the infinite knower helps us to understand the contrast, right, between transcendental and our transcendental idealism and some other at least notional experience, which that's the only kind of experience there could be which is not transcendentally ideal. There could be different finite knowers could have different transcendentally ideal experience because they could have different forms of intuition, but they would also have to have the same categorical structure, and any finite creature would have to be idealizing experience in some way.
Okay. So let me ask you this. I mean, if you asked Kant, well, what is this reality? Well, we haven't. I mean, quickly we can say that. Well, I guess you said there is controversy between whether he meant you should think of the noumenal and phenomenal as two completely different realms or two aspects. Maybe you should spend a minute helping me better understand what the difference would be between those two. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I probably fall in, when I'm just talking, I probably fall into a two-aspect kind of idiom because, I mean, partly because I think that's the better interpretation of Kant, although I think there is real ambiguity in the text, and there's a reason why he's borne these different interpretations for hundreds of years. But I also think it's the more philosophically interesting and credible kind of side of philosophically viable kind of version of Kant. So it's pretty clear, I think, what the noumenal means on the two-aspect view. We're bringing this whole elaborate form, which involves space-time and things like object and property and cause and effect and agent and patient and all these different basic concepts, and we're sort of putting that structure into the world. And then to get back to objects conforming to us and us conforming to objects, it's sort of the interaction between the world and this
apparatus of interpretation.
Yeah, very good. This apparatus of interpretation that we sort of bring to it, our empirical world is the intersection of those two things.
Uh-huh.
So we can conceive of reality before we structure it, that, or reality as that thing which is out there, and which well, here, back to the book.
Uh-huh.
When I experience this book for Kant, I am bringing the basic concept of object. I'm bringing the basic concept of property, and I'm bringing the whole attendant grammar that goes with that. And I'm bringing space and time. And so rectangularity is something that's derived from space. And the fact that I can see it across time now, and also now the same book is an interaction of objecthood and time, right? Because I'm seeing it's, it is this book, not a book, but this book. Mm-hmm. And it's still this book at a later time. And I'm bringing all of that with me and sort of putting it into what I see and experience. But I don't determine that this book is right here, right? The world does.
What do you mean? Well, you mean because that's where you found the book? Or you mean...
meaning whatever I see is going to be spatiotemporal, is going to be categorical, but I don't determine.
You don't get to decide. So yeah. So I'm the one who decides, in a sense. My mind insists that the tree in my front yard is oriented in space and time, but I don't get to move the tree.
Right.
Okay.
So the fact that you experience a tree and not some other spatiotemporal categorical thing is the contribution that the world makes.
Right.
And we can never conceive of reality except for that contribution that the world makes to our knowledge.
We can never conceive of reality except, say the rest of that again? As
that external reality which makes a contribution to our knowledge.
Okay. But we make more contributions to it than is commonly realized, according to Kant.
Right. So why I chided you about naive empiricist.
Right.
Kant is, in certain sense, an empiricist. There are many meanings that can be given to that word, but experience is still very important to his worldview.
Well, yeah, empiricism, and this is something that I think I came to appreciate through a conversation with Dan Kaufman that also was on Meaning of Life TV. That empiricists, taken to a certain point, wind up being very uncertain that there's anything out there. I mean, strictly speaking, all we can say for sure is that, like, there's something impinging on my eyeball that leads to the following conclusion about reality, or things like that.
They can end up very close to an idealist position, which is what happened to a lot of the 20th century empiricists.
Right. So there's less distance between a British empiricist and a Berkeley than you might think.
Yes, definitely.
So let me ask you this. So if I ask Kant, well, try to describe the noumenal to me, he'd go, you're missing the point. My whole point is again, but and he would probably have trouble coming up with a metaphor. But I think the modern world makes it easier to at least come up with a metaphor that of something that is kind of wholly other than what we're seeing, and yet is responsible for it. And that is if we think about some kind of simulation hypothesis or something, and the idea of computer code, right? Like And is that worth thinking about at all with respect to, because that would be, I mean, would that be a Kantian? I'm just trying to think, like if really what's going on right now is that there's just a bunch of computer code, like in the Matrix, I guess, right, generating what I'm seeing. Would that be? That doesn't map very closely onto what he's talking about in a way, does it?
Well, it could, maybe, if we take it more in a two worlds direction. So the thing about the Matrix is that you can get out of it, right?
Yeah.
It's just sort of simulated reality, but then you can move out of it into real reality. Then there's the the total recall question of how do you ever know that you really got out? Right. But that's a different question. So if we, of
course, with the Matrix sort of, reality, well, never mind. Go ahead.
Yeah, if that would be sort of, we can't get out of what we experience while remaining finite. But maybe there's a whole other realm that's available to God that is something which exists apart from the world that we see.
Uh-huh.
And you can see very easily how that could have great theological importance. Maybe the noumenal isn't just sort of this abstracting away from the empirical reality that we experience, that I went through in the putting forward the two aspect view. Maybe it's also somewhere you can go to, right? In some sense, or it's a whole. But the thing that becomes incredibly difficult when you try to characterize the noumenal as this kind of independent reality is you can't categorize it, right? You can't conceive of it through the categories, because whatever it is, it can't be...
It transcends the categories.
That's a kind of a different.
It's beyond our categories.
Right. It's not conceivable through the basic architecture of object and property and cause and effect and relation and all of that stuff. Can't get a grip on it, but it's something, and it's out there, and it's some way somehow. That's kind of the two worlds view. And the question I wish Kant would have thought about was, should we think of whatever God is doing, the way God cognitively relates to the world, as cognition? Or because it's so different from anything we do. But maybe there's a kind of way of relating to the world that God's capable of that is more directly related to the way the world is, independently of any way that we think about it.
Yeah. Now, let me ask you a God-related question. So, when I was thinking that Rudolf Otto, and your view is we don't know for sure whether Rudolf Otto was or was not taking his cues from Kant, even though ostensibly his numinous has a different etymology from Kant's. But
my view is I didn't know who Rudolf Otto was until you started talking.
It's a pretty famous book. The idea of the holy. He was a German theologian, I think, around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, and he had observed religious experience. Well, for one thing, I think he had observed it in cultures, kind of what he would have called pre-modern, or somebody would have called, so I think he spent some time talking about what would have been called primitive religious experience. It involved awe. It involved fear. It was an encounter with something wholly other. And when he saw what he called numinous in the thing that was being contacted, I took it to mean that the numinous is the divine in that scenario. But what I'm hearing you say, and I take you to be representing Kant here, is more like not that God is the numinous, but that God would be able to see the numinous, whereas finite creatures inherently cannot.
But he's also part of the numinous.
He's also part of it.
Yeah, he is noumenal himself. Positing any God, so in that sense, Kant is traditional, and seeing God as outside space-time nature. But there's also the noumenal world, which is some kind of reality which exists for God as the infinite cognizer.
Mm-hmm. Now, what is I assume there's a pretty close connection of the numinous to this notion of the thing in itself, the ding and sock, or whatever, however you pronounce it.
Ding on Zeke.
Ding on Zeke. And does that also come from Kant, the idea of the thing in itself as opposed to the thing you're perceiving? And so the thing in itself,
the phenomenal?
It would be the noumenal aspect of the phenomenal? Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, on a two aspects view, right? So,
right.
The phenomenal is things as they appear to us, and the noumenal is things as they are in themselves. It's as simple as that. They're pretty much interchangeable, but you can't be seduced into thinking that there are differentiated noumenal things which are identical to empirical apparent things, right? The idea that, like, for this book or for your tree, there's a noumenal book or a noumenal tree. Which
it's not like a one-to-one correspondence, because presumably the noumenal is not that discrete.
Yes, right. You can't to posit a token identity relationship and a one-to-one identity between noumenal and phenomenal things is to project the concept of object beyond possible experience into the noumenal realm, and that's always for Kant a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you can see him kind of struggling, because there's a part of the book called just on the distinction between phenomena and noumena that he rewrote substantially in the two editions, and I think he kind of saw that better in the second edition and changed some of the language.
Okay.
Yeah. So that it can't be an identity relationship between phenomena and noumena, but it can be but somehow it's got to be the noumenal has a role to play, right?
I mean, there is, I mentioned the idea of emptiness in Buddhism, but a mystical and a kind of Eastern idea that is related to that, but not exactly the same thing, is just the idea that our perception of reality is to some extent a function of our language, in a sense. I mean, we are imposing. I mean, the idea that we're imposing categories on things is kind of mystical, right? I mean, you already said certain people took it in that direction, but in a way they didn't have to. That notion preceded them in the history of mystical philosophies, right?
Yeah, but the big difference is, for Kant, it's not a mistake. It's just the way we do things, but it's the way we do things. So,
but wouldn't he say, he would not say, I mean, he would not say ultimate reality is in some sense truer, or he would say it's more ultimate, right? I mean, look, if he's religious and he's associating the noumenal with God, he has to say it's in some sense superior.
Well, that's why I think I think that in his engagement with Hume and kind of traditional theoretical philosophy, that's most of where you get the two aspect stuff. And then God kind of forces him into more of a two worlds kind of understanding. And that's part of why the text has borne these different interpretations. But it depends. One view you can take out of Kant, which I think is a more sort of resolutely empiricist view, is the idea that if we meet another, like a race of aliens who organize experience in a non-spatiotemporal way, and like kind of Arrival was partly about this, they have fundamentally different ways.
What was the thing? Remind us. What was the thing about the alien language in that movie? Like, what was fundamentally different about the way they communicated? It wasn't. Well, I'm trying to remember. It was kind of like smoke signals, but not exactly right. What was it?
They didn't experience time as linear.
Oh, okay, right.
Because they just the way what they brought to the world and the way they conceptualized things was so different that they didn't experience things as then and now and before and after. It was all kind of we could meet another creature maybe who doesn't conceive of the world in space-time. Maybe they conceive of it as Zeiss, Zyme, something completely different, but are their modes of receptivity. And if you want to ask if reality is more spatiotemporal or more Zeissio-temporal, that's just a confused question.
Yeah, well, I mean, let me just interject this. I mean, Einstein, I believe, insisted that we think of time as more on par with spatial dimensions than had been the custom. And the idea of a space-time continuum is just plug time in as another dimension, right? It's like just see it as another dimension. And also Einstein, his notion of time, I believe, I think he's a determinist, which means that the future, in a sense, already exists, in the sense that whatever it's going to be from our point of view is there's no changing it. And another way, so we are creatures who view the three dimensions of space as kind of, fixed in time, and they're the things we can survey right now. And then time is the dimension we have to move through one increment at a time. We don't have the option of looking forward in time. But Einstein's view suggests that maybe that could be an arbitrary feature of our species. And you can imagine a species that when they say, what lies ahead, they can tell you right away. But when they say, what lies to the north, they say, you got to wait and find out. I mean, the north just comes one increment at a time, right? Right. You can imagine a reorientation that radical, and Kant could imagine that. Is that right?
Yeah.
He did. I'm not saying he did, but
you could imagine an orientation that is that radically different from our orientation to reality. More so, even more radically different, because that's still a temporal relationship.
Right.
So we're presupposing the same space and time concepts or forms of intuition, but just imagining a different orientation toward them. For Kant, to imagine a different kind of creature would be to imagine that they just have a totally different and perhaps inconceivable to us kind of orientation, or at least if we could
that doesn't involve space and time.
That doesn't involve space or time, but involves some other kind of organization which would be completely foreign to us and unprecedented in our experience. So,
okay. Well, we've been going at this for about an hour and 20 minutes, and as you predicted before we started recording, it would get darker and darker where you are, yes, as is indeed happening. So is there before we sign off, is there any kind of summary thing you want to say? I'm glad to hear that there could turn out to be a Kant, Rudolf Otto connection. I mean, one reason the numinous interests me is because of the connection to religion. One of several reasons. But is there anything you want to say about any of this?
The kind of closing thought, and I was kind of building to this when talking about space-time, space-time. Mm-hmm. It's if you're asking whether our way of experiencing things is more related to the reality than the aliens, you're kind of involved in a confusion.
Right.
And if you have a two-aspect view, you don't feel trapped by space-time and the categories. It's just you needed some way to organize it. This is the way we organize it. Mm-hmm. This is as real as it's ever going to get. But if you think that there's something outside and that maybe we want to have some relationship to it.
In other words, this is the two-world scenario.
Yeah, you need a two worlds reading if you're going to have something that you kind of regret not being able to experience. Mm-hmm. And so Ray Langton, in a book I didn't like very much, but she makes a very basic point that the two-aspect view can't be all there is because, well, she didn't actually put it in those terms, but Kant thinks there's something we don't get because of our way of experiencing the world, and that it's a real shame that we don't get it. Mm-hmm. So that kind of pushes you into a more two worlds interpretation. So the theologians and the people who would like, at least in principle, to get something outside of our experience or transcend experience in that way, they're going to need to pick up a kind of two worlds Kant.
Although the transcendence is ultimately impossible, according to Kant.
According to Kant,
it's theoretically possible. I mean, there's true transcendence is at least theoretically possible, but practically impossible in Kant's two worlds universe.
Well, you need some capacity other than reason. Uh-huh. But maybe if you experience the noumenal, it can't be through concepts or through empirical experience, but maybe there's some capacity of the soul which can have a very different.
That seems Eastern. The idea that, not just that you wouldn't do it through concepts, that concepts are an obstacle.
Right. Yeah.
Is okay. Well, this is a lot to think about.
Yeah. Very ineffable, but veridical, right?
Yeah. Well, this is William James's. His definition of mystical experience is noetic, but ineffable. It imparts knowledge, but you can't describe the knowledge. But yeah, the same. You can't describe it in language, but it's true. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm looking for. I will let you know.
Yeah, let me know if you find it.
Yeah, and if you happen upon it, you know who to call.
Yeah, I don't hold out great hope.
Okay, well, thank you. The contrast between us has become quite stark. You are almost completely dark, and I seem that much more illuminated by virtue of that. So where is there a place people can find your stuff in particular? Do you have a Twitter handle or anything you want to talk about?
Just David Ottlinger, at David Ottlinger.
Ottlinger. It's one word, David Ottlinger on your Twitter handle?
Yep. And okay. I occasionally submit something to Arc Digital. I hope I still do. So maybe check out there. Anyway, it's a good place. So lots of interesting stuff for people who are interested in
and
this
there
kind
is
of
some
thing.
of your stuff on the archives of Electric Agora, probably?
Yep. And I'll probably show up.
And there will be stuff there.
Yeah. And I'll probably do convos with Dan at some point.
Yeah, that's a recommended destination site. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you, David. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, me too.